Hey guys, what's up? I'm Erin and welcome back to the channel. Are Americans keeping too much cash on hand? Well, I suppose it depends on which headlines you're reading. Well, first we have reports saying that American savings rates are hitting 14-year lows, currently sitting at about 3.5%. Over the long term, traditionally Americans are saving usually around 9%. And yes, that long-term rate is definitely lower than what experts traditionally recommend, which is usually more around the 20% range. But the fact that we're sitting at 3.5% might signal a worsening situation. But then on the flip side, you have headlines like this one from Personal Capital. A recent report suggests that Americans have almost record levels of cash on hand, with a typical Personal Capital user having $60,000 of cash at the ready. So what gives? Are savings rates falling? Do people have too much cash on hand? Can you have too much cash on hand? Well, the answers to those questions would be yes, maybe, and maybe. It all depends on your situation. From an obvious standpoint, we're in the midst of a period of high inflation. The cost of practically everything around us, from food, utilities, housing, transportation, you name it, it's all increasing. And for most people, their paycheck is not keeping pace with inflation, meaning expenses are rising, so their savings rate is falling, because after all, you only have so many dollars to go around. But not all income levels are affected in the same manner. Those with lower incomes are hit even harder in these circumstances simply because they have less discretionary income to begin with. Naturally, with a recession looming, or if a recession is already here, I guess it depends on who you ask, people will tend to beef up their savings in an attempt to weather that future storm. But it's when people stop saving and instead start to spend their savings that we get a signal that the economy is worsening. Even though savings rates are falling, many economists predict that Americans still have significant cash on hand. Back during the pandemic, the average personal savings rate hit a high of 34%. So people were stocking away cash. And best estimates are that people have used only 30% of their pandemic savings, and that consumers still have more than enough to stave off a recession next year if people choose to run it down. Meaning if consumers are willing to spend their savings, they could potentially hold off that recession, assuming it's not here already. Honestly, at this point, I don't even know how to answer that question. But it's when consumers pull back on their spending, that's when recessions get worse. Because if consumers spend less, that leads to a slowdown in the economy. So what do personal savings look like right now? Let's go to that Personal Capital study to find out. As you can see, the average American is keeping anywhere from a quarter to a third of their entire portfolio in cash. And yes, that's a lot of cash. As you go up through the age brackets, you see that cash balances increase, which is to be expected. It follows the same trend as net worth. As you get older, your net worth tends to increase. You have a greater number of working years and saving years under your belt. I'm going to say one thing real quick here. The typical user of Personal Capital is probably a pretty financially savvy individual, so they probably have a higher savings rate, a higher investment rate, just from the simple fact that they are using personal financial management tools. So I would say take these numbers with a grain of salt. But at first glance, these numbers do look sort of inflated, especially when you consider that the typical recommendation is to have anywhere from 3 to 6 months worth of cash as an emergency fund. If you have monthly expenses of, say, $5,000, a fully funded emergency fund would look something like $15,000 to $30,000. Keeping cash on hand is part of an overall balanced portfolio and honestly just good practice. But there is an inherent danger in keeping too much cash on hand. Cash just sitting idle is losing value at the rate of inflation, and currently inflation is sitting at about 8.5%. Now, as to why people may have elevated cash levels, there are plenty of reasons, and many of them are great reasons. As to that generally recommended 3 to 6 months cash in an emergency fund, it's just a general guideline, and it doesn't fit in all circumstances. Many people are holding on to extra cash because of a recession or the threat of a recession, or for others, maybe cash is seen as a safe harbor in case you lose your job, or maybe you're saving up for a major expense, or maybe you're at or near retirement and having a year or two's worth of cash on hand prevents you from having to dip into your investments when they're down, or maybe simply having more cash on hand helps you sleep at night. All of these reasons are great reasons to have more cash. At the end of the day, you have to do what works for you on a personal level. And to be honest, I know my audience. I know many of you have said that you're beefing up your cash reserves with the intent of shoveling it into the market when the market settles down a bit. And while this does have a small ring of market timing to it, I get it. 2022 has been a rough year for the stock market. And as long as you're still dollar cost averaging into the market and then saving some extra on the side, who can argue with that? But with all that said, if you have cash on hand that covers more than 6 months worth of expenses or more than 12 months worth of expenses if you're at or near retirement, I think you have to put that money to work. There are ways to capture a better return while still keeping that money safe. The first place to put your money is a high yield savings account. Honestly, I love a high yield savings account, and who doesn't? It's my preferred place to keep my emergency fund. Just like a traditional bank account, high yield savings accounts are FDIC insured up to $250,000. They're highly liquid. You can access them at absolutely any time. They're convenient. You can make as many deposits and withdrawals as you need to throughout the month. And there's usually no fees or minimums, or if there is a minimum, it's usually very low, like $1. Right now, high yield savings accounts are paying 2 to 3%, but this is likely to increase as the Fed continues rate hikes. And I have to say, while I am a huge fan of high yield savings accounts, I'm not the person who's out there constantly switching accounts just chasing that higher yield. If the one I'm sitting in, for example, is paying 2.5% and I know there's one out there that pays 3%, I'm not going to change accounts. I'm going to stay right where I am. Let's say I have $10,000 in a high yield account. At a 2.5% rate, that's $250 in interest. At a 3% rate, that's $300. I look at the whole process of opening a new account and transferring the money as more of a hassle than that $50 is actually worth. So I think it's just simple to pick a high yield savings account you like and stay put. It just makes life easier. However, if you want to chase a higher yield, you can. It's your life, you do you. Next, I like money market accounts. Money market accounts, just like savings accounts, are FDIC insured. However, they do tend to have higher initial deposit amounts, often around $1,000, and they can limit the number of withdrawals you can make in a given month. Money market accounts tend to have very similar interest rates to high yield savings accounts, so it's my personal preference just to stick with high yield savings accounts just because they have slightly less restrictions. But with that said, money market accounts are still a great option, and ultimately it just comes down to personal preference. The other option for money you don't need in the next 12 months or so are CDs. CDs are safe, they're FDIC insured, they often have a higher initial deposit amount, but they also pay higher interest than high yield savings and money market accounts, and they also have a penalty for early withdrawal. CDs do lock your money up for a year or 18 months or even a couple years depending on the CD term length that you choose. If you access your money before the CD matures, there is a penalty. Generally speaking, it's 2 to 4 months worth of interest, but it does vary depending on the CD and its specific provisions. But you are entitled to your original deposit back. But if you think interest rates are going to go up and you don't want to take all your excess cash you have right now and put it in a CD that matures a year from now, you can create a CD ladder. For instance, you can start a CD this month that matures a year from now. Next month, you could start one that matures a year from that date and then repeat this process for 12 months. Then once you reach the time when the first CD starts to mature, you can put that money back in a new CD to keep that 12-month ladder going, or you can decide to put that money elsewhere. A more traditional CD ladder would invest immediately into 5 individual CDs, spread over 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5-year maturity dates. Once each reaches maturity, it is reinvested into a new 5-year CD. This way, you would have one CD that matures each year. But remember, finance is personal. You can make your ladder look like anything you want. But CDs are a great way to get a better return on your money rather than simply letting it sit in cash. It's important to keep in mind that if you have money sitting in cash, you want to try to capture some level of return on it. And don't just assume because you have a savings account at a bank that it is a high yield savings account. In fact, most savings accounts are not high yield accounts. As of September 2022, the national average interest rates on savings accounts was just 0.14%. So at the very least, you want to utilize a high yield savings account. My personal preference is a high yield savings account combined with laddered CDs. And also it is important to note that none of these options beat inflation, but they do help preserve more of your purchasing power than if your cash was just sitting on the sidelines. So they're an option to consider. Let me know your thoughts in a comment down below. Do you use high yield savings accounts or do you use laddered CDs? I'm really curious. I post new videos every single week. If you got anything at all out of this one, please give it a like. If you're new here, please consider subscribing, or if you know of someone who might get something out of this type of content, please consider sharing. I'll see you soon. Bye. saying that, and yes, that definitely, our saving, our, it's like a pirate person. Oh. People, the cost of pace at the same, naturally, entire emergency fund. No. Actually hit, that sucks. Cash on hand. And that, meaning if consumer spending leads to a slowdown in the, meaning if consumers can, because consumers, that leads to, I don't know. At this point, I don't know. It could potentially, I'm not gonna move. Sitting, you're at or near retire of the CD. CDs will typically, and their clauses.